Guys, Marianne from Dog First Aid here. I want to take a few moments to talk to you about heat stroke today. It's something that unfortunately we do still see in dogs every year, and we are still sadly seeing really severe cases and dogs that aren't surviving. I want to talk for a bit about what heat stroke is, what causes it, it's a little more complicated than you might think, how to prevent it and what to do if it happens. So there's a difference between heat stroke and heat stress. Heat stress is something that most of us have probably experienced at some point, where you've gone and had a nice sunbathe, you've gotten up, you're feeling really lightheaded and dizzy, maybe your vision's a little bit blurry, and that evening maybe you've got a little tummy upset. That is heat stress, it is not heat stroke. Heat stroke is a serious medical emergency where you start to see organ failure, you'll see low blood sugar, you'll see electrolyte problems, so things like your potassium can go out of whack, and that can actually be life-threatening because it can affect the heart. You can eventually see brain damage, and of course it can be fatal. So heat stroke and heat stress, two different things, very different levels of how serious they are. For dogs, the normal temperature is between 38 and 39.1 Celsius. Now, some ranges will be slightly different than that, but that's the ballpark we're working with. I see dogs on a hot day with temperatures up to 39.5 Celsius, and I don't worry about that at all. That's normal, it's a hot day. Once the temperature starts to approach your 40 degrees Celsius area, that's when I start to genuinely worry. That is less normal. We see start of genuine heat stroke at 41 Celsius. So that's when you might start seeing abnormalities if you took a blood test with the liver, the kidneys, the blood glucose and things like that. Heat stroke is not just about overheating. It seems logical, okay, you get too hot, and then you get heat stroke, sure enough, but heat stroke is different for different animals. Not every animal and not every individual from one species has the same heat stroke risk. The reason for that is that as we get hotter, as our bodies warm up, our oxygen demands in our tissues will increase. So we need to be able to provide our tissues with extra oxygen, more than we usually do. So animals that are unable to provide their bodies with that extra oxygen because their bodies need the extra oxygen if they're hot, those are the animals that are a higher risk of heat stroke. Thinking about dogs and thinking for a minute about your own individual dog, what does that mean? What dogs would be less able to provide themselves with more oxygen if they needed it? Well, elderly dogs, actually. If you're older, you have less what's called respiratory reserve, which essentially means that you're not able to breathe more efficiently if you need more oxygen. So there is a lower maximum amount of oxygen that you can get into your body per minute compared to when you were much younger. So elderly dogs are automatically at a higher risk of heat stroke. We're talking about getting less oxygen into yourself. Of course, brachycephalic breeds, which means short-nosed breeds, are at a much higher risk of heat stroke. The majority of dogs I see with heat stroke are brachycephalic breeds. I'm talking pugs, I'm talking French bulldogs, British bulldogs, boxers, even the odd Rottweiler can be at a higher risk, as well as King Charles Spaniels as well. There are two reasons why this is. Number one, obviously, yes, they can't get as much oxygen into their bodies because they have smaller airways compared to their body size, so that makes sense. But number two, as we get warmer, our body's tissues naturally will swell up, including the ones in our throat, including the ones in our mouth. So we're dealing with animals who are already struggling to get enough oxygen into their bodies, and now not only do they need more oxygen because it's hotter, but because it's hotter, they're able to get less oxygen into their bodies than on a normal day, as opposed to more, which is what they need. Overweight dogs, you won't be surprised to hear that they're at a higher risk of heat stroke because, of course, they've got all that extra insulation. But it's not just about the insulation. It's about the fact that the fat can weigh down the chest, make it harder to expand it, make it harder to breathe more. And also, there's usually a lot of fat around the airways. We see this especially in pugs, where there's a lot more fat in the neck and around the airways. And so that fat is going to, again, make it harder for them to get more oxygen on board. Dogs with known lung conditions, known breathing conditions, obviously can't get more oxygen on board in response to a higher oxygen demand. So dogs with known lung conditions such as asthma, such as what we call Westie lung, which is an inflammatory condition of the lungs in older Westies, those dogs are at a higher risk of heat stroke. That needs to be considered when you're deciding whether or not it's safe to exercise them or whether it's safe for them to be in a warm environment. Dogs with heart conditions are also at a higher risk of heat stroke because even though they can get the oxygen into their lungs, they can't then successfully transmit it around the body. So a dog with heart failure or heart disease is going to be at a higher risk of heat stroke. And it's worth knowing that actually heart disease is diagnosed far more in the summer than in the winter. And the reason for that is, of course, it's summer, it's hot, your dog needs more oxygen, and yet they're not able to provide that to themselves, and it can cause what's called decompensation, the situation where a dog goes from having a heart murmur that they were coping with and that wasn't really a problem to full-blown heart disease. So if your dog's ever been diagnosed with a heart murmur, even if they're completely fine, do consider their heat stroke risk as being maybe a little bit higher than a dog that doesn't have a heart murmur, and just be a little bit extra careful with them for that reason. The final group of dogs that are at a higher risk of heat stroke are the ones that are more likely to overheat themselves. So I'm looking at the Springer Spaniel parents especially here. If your dog is super energetic, then bear that in mind when it's hot weather. Don't just think, oh, they'll get too hot and then they'll stop running around. No, they'll get too hot and then they'll get heat stroke. I see it all the time as a vet, so do bear that in mind. Dogs do not have the common sense that we wish they had, and if you have a very energetic young dog especially, then consider either having them on lead or not even walking them if they're going to be too frustrated by being out and about on lead, and actually just say, okay, we're going to play in the house, we're going to play in the garden. And there are some fantastic games, some fantastic websites where you can get loads of ideas as to ways of keeping them mentally stimulated. One of my favorites is called Canine Enrichment. It's a group on Facebook, and you can go on there and you can get things as complex or as expensive as buying a Nina Otterson dog toy, as arts and craftsy as how to make your own rag rug with your kids over a weekend, or as simple and lazy and cheap as when you're chopping up your peppers to cook whatever you're cooking with, stick the leftover bits of pepper in the freezer, and then you can feed those to your dog later on. Or throwing some peas around the garden and they can chase those around and have a good little scent work game that isn't too exercisey. So when we're talking about heat stroke prevention, we're thinking about a couple of things. Number one, not over-exercising your dog if it's warm. And don't just think about those blazing summer days when it's 32 degrees. Think about those 18-degree days when it's really humid and balmy. As I'm recording this, we're going into a few days like that where it's going to be 24, 25 degrees, but it's going to be overcast. That's actually going to be just as likely to cause heat stroke as when it was 30 degrees but the pressure wasn't as high. If anything, we almost never see cases of heat stroke at the vets on the hottest day of the year because people know that it's the hottest day of the year. We tend to see cases of heat stroke at the vets when it's not the hottest day of the year, so people don't have that idea in their heads that it's that dangerous. So always be thinking about your dog's heat stroke risk as an individual, and remember that even if you feel comfortable in the temperature that it is, your dog is wearing a fur coat, and if your dog is, for example, an older pug or an older anything, then they are going to be at a higher risk than you of heat stroke. So just because you're comfortable doesn't mean your dog necessarily is. One final group that's at a higher risk of heat stroke are large and giant breed dogs, especially dogs that are very furry, have a dense coat and a dark coloured coat. So black Alsatians, I see a lot of German Shepherds with heat stroke, and I think there's a combination of factors that have caused that. They've got the black fur, so that is going to absorb more heat from the sun. They've got dense fur, so that is acting as an insulator. Because they're large, they have a greater surface area to volume ratio, which is a posh way of saying they are their own insulator because they're very big. One more thing I know a lot of pet parents do to help prevent heat stroke in their dogs is looking at cooling coats and cooling mats. These are very popular since last year, and they can be a fantastic tool if they're used properly. If they're used improperly though, they can actually be dangerous, so I just want to take a second to talk about them. The way a cooling coat works is that it's a gel-based coat. You soak it with cool water and then you pop that on your dog. And obviously it's then going to draw the heat away from your dog and into the actual coat itself. The time that becomes a problem is if the coat actually ever becomes as warm as the dog, because then it becomes a heating coat, which is not what we want at all. And this has actually happened to somebody I know, whereby the dog's parents left her with her cooling coat on. They left for work about 7:30 in the morning. The dog walker arrived around 11:30 in the morning to find the dog passed out on the kitchen floor in severe heat stroke. The dog was really, really lucky to have survived and absolutely wouldn't have done had the dog walker not been due to come in at the time that they did. And of course the parents meant well. They thought they were doing a really good thing for their dog. But it just goes to show that cooling coats are great to use if you think it's probably safe to walk my dog, but I just want to have that extra safety, make them more comfortable, so I'm going to put a coat on them, but not something to leave with them unsupervised. Cooling mats can be great because your dog can choose to go onto the mat or can choose to come off of the mat. So cooling mats shouldn't have the same problem as cooling coats in terms of potentially overheating the dog. The downsides of a cooling mat are that if you have a dog that likes to chew and eat objects, including bedding, then it might not be safe to leave a cooling mat down for your dog. And also, it's not safe to leave a cooling mat down for your dog in the car. I'll explain why in a second. It is never safe to leave a dog in a car on a hot day unless it's nicely in the shade and really well ventilated. Essentially, if you wouldn't feel comfortable sitting in that car with the doors shut the way you're leaving your dog, then there's no excuse for leaving your dog in that car. Some people will try to leave a bowl of water or maybe a cooling mat in the car with the dog. I don't think that's a good idea, and I think if anything that can make things more dangerous. If you're leaving your dog in the car for so long that you don't think they can wait until you get back to have a drink of water, then you are leaving your dog in your car for too long. But the main reason that I don't like leaving bowls of water or cooling mats in cars with dogs is because it makes the atmosphere a lot more humid. There's going to be evaporation from the surface of that water, from the surface of that cooling mat, and that is quickly going to make the atmosphere in the car muggier. Even with the windows open, it's not going to make a real difference. You are still going to have a muggier air in that car. And if you had two identical cars, two identical dogs, left them all closed, one with a cooling mat or a bowl of water in the car with the dog and the other without, the dog that was in the car with the water would get heat stroke significantly faster than the one that was in the dry car. Same goes actually for if your dog's just been for a swim and then you leave them in the car. Again, that is dangerous because it's going to get very humid and very muggy very quickly. So anything involving water is not a way of making a car safe for a dog. Don't get me wrong, water is a great way of cooling a dog down if you're out and about. So yes, do have water with you when you go on your dog walks. Do let your dog go for a nice swim, bearing in mind the safety of wherever it is they're swimming, of course. And you can even just use the water that you have in your water bottle for yourself and or for your dog to help cool them down while you're going around. So we'll talk a little bit in a second about what to do in cases of heat stroke, and you would cool your dog down in exactly the same way whether they had heat stroke or whether you were just trying to prevent it. I recently did the Muddy Dog Challenge for Battersea Dogs and Cats Home, and they actually had buckets of water with sponges, and we were using that to help cool the dogs down, and that's a really good idea as well. So if you're in your garden with your dog and your dog's being a bit of a moron and staying in the sun a little bit too much, you may have to shut them indoors because dogs will give themselves heat stroke just lying in the sun like idiots, but you can also use a sponge just to prolong the amount of time that they can safely enjoy the sunshine. Okay, so we've spent a little bit of time on preventing heat stroke. How do we recognise heat stroke? Well, you won't be surprised to hear that a dog with heat stroke would be panting. Absolutely they would. They will also have an increased heart rate because remember, they're trying to get more oxygen around the body. So it's a really good idea to be able to take your own dog's heart rate, their pulse. That's something we teach on our courses, and it's a good idea to know what is normal for your dog. So we ask our course candidates to check it at least once a week so that they can get really familiar, that they're confident that they can find that pulse quickly and easily, and that they know exactly what's normal for their dog. They almost don't even need to count it. They can go, well, that feels a bit fast. Your dog's gum colour is also going to get redder, darker. So get used to what colour your dog's gums normally are and start getting into the habit, if it's hot weather, of just checking that. Just see, is that normal for them, or is it starting to go a little bit red? If it is, then check their temperature to see whether they might have heat stroke or be developing a problem. There's also a thing called the CRT, the capillary refill time. That is if you press down on your dog's gum or lip, somewhere where it's pink, until it goes white, and then you let go. That's the capillary refill time, the CRT. In a normal dog, that should be between 1 and 2 seconds, but in a dog with heat stroke, it will be super fast. It will be quicker than a second. That's another sign that your dog might be developing heat stroke. Of course, the most straightforward way of knowing whether your dog has heat stroke is also to check their temperature. 41 degrees is where we start to really think, okay, this dog is going to need to go to the vet because this dog is having a medical emergency right now. If they're getting close to 40 degrees, then you're definitely in your, I need to cool my dog down straight away, I need to cancel whatever hot thing it is that I am doing and get somewhere cool. If you think your dog is showing signs of heat stroke, so they're panting, their gums seem red, they seem lethargic, it's a hot day, so you're suspicious of it, and then you check their temperature and it's lower, that doesn't definitely mean that they don't have heat stroke. Have I confused you yet? The reason for this is that once that temperature reaches that 41 degrees, and once that organ failure starts to develop, effectively the dog then goes into shock. And when a dog is in shock, their temperature is going to drop. So even if they are in shock because of heat stroke, their temperature can be low. And I have had dogs arrive in heat stroke with a temperature of 37.5 degrees, which is below a normal healthy dog temperature. So if you check your dog's temperature and it is low, that isn't a reason to think that they don't have heat stroke. You still want to be getting them to the vet if you're suspicious of heat stroke. But obviously, if their temperature is low, you don't want to cool them down because that's not going to help them at this point. So you want to cool your dog down either because they have heat stroke or you're worried that they might, or you just want to avoid it and you're thinking they look a little bit too warm today. What's the best way of doing that? Well, until recently we used to say wet towels were a good idea, but the problem with wet towels is, similarly to those cooling coats, they can actually very quickly become insulating and warm the dog up. So we now recommend that you use water. Don't use ice cold water because that can actually constrict the blood vessels and reduce the amount of heat exchange that we're getting. So it's not necessarily as effective as using cool room temperature water. That's what we usually recommend. If you have a dog that has a really, really dense coat, then the risk with getting the entire dog wet is that if they do develop heat stroke and go into shock, it is going to be very hard to warm them back up again and get their temperature back to normal. So instead of doing that, what we recommend is that you focus on a few key areas with getting your dog wet. And those key areas need to be the areas of best heat exchange for a dog. So dogs sweat through their pores, so getting their feet wet is a very good idea to start off with. Then you want to work on the areas where we've got very superficial major blood vessels. So they've got massive blood vessels in their armpits, big blood vessels in their groin and inner thighs, and also obviously big significant blood vessels all around the throat and neck. I wouldn't do the throat and neck if you've got a dog that's having trouble breathing and that's going to be stressed by it, because you might actually cause a little drowning or a little choking, and that's not something that we want to have happen. But if your dog seems like they would tolerate it, then get the area around the back of the neck and the throat nice and wet, because that's going to help cool down the spine as well as the major blood vessels in that area. While you're doing all this, somebody needs to be cooling the car down, so that's either get it into the shade with all the windows open, maybe throw a few ice packs in there from the fridge or frozen peas or whatever it is you have to spare, or, you know, if you're luckier than me, get your aircon on. That's a lot more straightforward. Remember, you do want to get your dog to the vet. They might have low blood sugar that needs supplementing. The vet will also be able to give them oxygen to provide to their tissues, which will be super beneficial and reduce the extra damage that's being caused. And they'll also be able to put them on a drip, a nice cool drip running directly into the vein, cooling your dog from the inside. And of course, it's not just cars that can cause dogs to overheat. Conservatories and kitchens can be just as dangerous if they're not properly ventilated and or if there's no area of shade for the dog. I know that some pet parents are tempted to leave their dogs with garden access when it's really hot so that they can have some lovely fresh air and enjoy the garden. I don't recommend it at all. Dog theft is massively on the rise. It is really dangerous to leave your dog with outdoor access if you're not in the house. As well as we've seen a lot of cases of dogs jumping over even 6-foot fences and ending up running around on the roads. Luckily, I've not had one hit by a car yet this year, but it does happen and it's a tragedy when it does. So, the classic situation, dog in a hot car, what do you do if it's not your dog? I'm going to start with a disclaimer that I am not a police officer nor am I a lawyer. So this is dog first aid's understanding from the people we've spoken to, but obviously a police officer or lawyer might be able to give you even more thorough advice than this. Our understanding is that breaking into a car can result in criminal damages charges no matter why you broke into that car. So breaking into a car is never 100% legally neutral. So if you see a dog in a car on a hot day, our recommendation is to start off by just observing the dog. Does the dog actually look distressed, or do they seem pretty chilled about it? Because if they seem calm, it could be that that person is literally just posting a letter across the road and they're going to be back in a few seconds. So if the dog doesn't seem distressed, if you can just wait around for a few minutes, see whether anybody turns up. If the dog is already distressed, or if you waited and nobody is turning up, then see if you can find the owner. Sometimes you'll be outside that one shop, so you know that you can get them to make an announcement and there's a 95% chance that the owner is in there somewhere. You might just be able to call out as well, is this anybody's dog, is this anybody's car? You can also try the doors. If they're the kind of muppet who's left their dog locked in a car on a hot day, then they might also be the kind of muppet who's actually not locked their car in the first place. And it's not illegal to open a car that's not yours. Ultimately, you might find that you have a situation where the dog is in serious distress, you can't easily get hold of the owner, and you're not able to open the car. The police recommend that you call them first. If you call the police, they might well be able to come round and break into the car, and that way your hands are clean. If they're not able to make it in time, if there's a serious worry and you think they're not going to get here, then if you do decide that you're going to break into a car, and this is not me telling you that you should do that, by the way, but if you were to decide that you were going to do that, then it would be a very good idea to take a quick little video on your phone so you can demonstrate, there's the dog is clearly in distress, the car is clearly locked, look at me trying to open the door, and this is the number plate of the car so we know who we're talking about. There'll be a time signature on that video so the police can go, right, okay, well in Oxford on that day it was 31 degrees, so yes, I expect it was probably quite hot in that car. Obviously, I hope this is advice that you never need to use. If you do manage to get the dog out of the car, get them into the shade, get them somewhere as cool as possible, and start the cooling, the active cooling, as we discussed earlier in terms of treating heat stroke in your dog. In terms of the legalities of calling the vet in that situation, that dog is the legal property of the owner, so yes, you are removing their legal property from where they expected to find it. But I think that most people would understand if you felt you had to do that. Certainly do call the nearest vet if you can, the nearest emergency vet, and they will be able to advise you. They might ask you to rush the dog straight down from the point of view of wanting to save the dog's life. That's probably more likely to be the case than them coming out to you, because as I say, one of the things the dog really needs in this moment is they need to be put on oxygen, and vets can't readily transport oxygen to you. I have noticed a bit of a battle raging on social media about whether or not you should shave a dog in hot weather to help them keep cool. There are a couple of things I want to say about this. Number one, I am not a groomer, so I am taking no responsibility for what you do to your dog's coat in terms of how that affects the coat growth or what the coat looks like in future. And I know that a lot of groomers will say that there are certain dogs that if you clip that coat, it's going to look a bit weird forever. And you need to take your groomer's advice on that. But what I do know is that there is no thermodynamic logic in the theory that having more fur keeps you cooler. That does not happen. Having more fur can reduce your chances of getting skin cancer and getting sunburn, absolutely, because it protects you from the sun's rays. But it is an insulator. Your body temperature, if you're a dog, is at least 38 degrees. The outside temperature in the UK is never as hot as 38 degrees, or almost never. So it is always cooler outside the dog. So anything that insulates the dog from the outside world is always going to act to keep them warmer rather than to keep them cooler. There are some thermal imaging camera pictures going around on social media where the shaved part of the dog shows up hotter than the unshaved part of the dog. Just to quickly explain that, the reason for that is that the thermal imaging camera reads the heat signature of the dog. So the area that's shaved, more heat is leaving the dog in that area, so more heat is making it to the camera. So that area would look red or yellow or green. The area that isn't shaved, less heat is leaving the dog in that area because it's more insulated, so the dog is staying warmer. Less heat is reaching the camera, so the camera is showing it up as blue. So those thermal imaging cameras, they really need to be understood to be properly interpreted. As I say, not a groomer. What happens to your dog's fur if you decide to cut it is your responsibility. In terms of how much does cutting your dog's fur, is there any benefit in cutting your dog's fur? Well, I think there is, but I think the greater benefit is not over-exercising them when it's too warm to exercise that particular dog, and bearing in mind the environmental temperature that they're in, so cars, conservatories, etc. But yes, it can make some dogs more comfortable, it can make life a bit easier for some dogs, it can mean that some dogs are able to exercise maybe just a little bit more than they otherwise could. I think the dogs that it really makes a difference for are the ones with very dense, very dark fur, especially very large dogs. So for example, yesterday in fact I saw a border collie who had an episode of heat stress on the weekend, not full heat stroke luckily for him. This border collie was, I think, about 12 years old. He was borderline obese and he had quite long fur that was very dense. And I did ask his parents, A, to switch him onto a senior diet, partly because it's better for a dog that's older to have less protein, but also because senior diet's lower in calories, so it would help his weight loss a little bit. But I also did ask them to give him a nice haircut because he has such dense fur that that's going to act as a really strong insulator. And if you don't believe me, I will use myself as an example here. Behold my undercut. Can you see it? Can you see it? So I had this side of my head and the underneath of my head around the back shaved. I started doing that last summer, and I didn't do it for appearance reasons. I genuinely did it because I have incredibly dense hair and I get way too hot in the summer, and I can tell you it feels amazing having that shaved. I can strongly recommend it. You can also do it so that nobody can see, so if you have long hair and you want it to look like you have long hair, you can just have them cut the hair behind. Let me see there, just behind. You can just have them shave the back of your head, so I still look like I have a full head of hair, but my head isn't getting as hot as it was before. And again, if you put a thermal imaging camera on me, this side of the head would look blue, this side of the head would look red and yellow, but this side of the head feels so much cooler and so much better. I do have to apply sunscreen to it though when the hair is super short, because otherwise I could get sunburn. So yes, hair has a protective effect, but of course it also has an insulating effect. Okay, so let's take a minute to see what you've remembered. I'm going to show you guys a series of photos of dogs with a little description of the individual dog on the photo, and I'm asking you guys to rate 1 to 3 what is that dog's heat stroke risk. If number 1 is it's the lowest possible heat stroke risk, and number 3 is it's the highest possible heat stroke risk. So bearing in mind what we talked about in terms of what causes heat stroke, have a look at these photos and take a guess. The answers will come up after you've had a few seconds to think about it. What did you do? If any was super confusing, try rewinding the video and see if you get an answer. If you don't, you can email us at dogfirstaid.com and you can try and get an answer out of me that way. Okay guys, we have covered so much. So we now understand how heat stroke occurs and what causes it, what dogs are at a higher risk of heat stroke and how to reduce the risk of heat stroke happening in a dog, what to do if a dog does develop heat stroke, how to look out for it and how to recognise it, and what to do if you find a dog in a hot car in distress. This talk essentially forms part of our dog first aid course, which also includes things like CPR, what to do in terms of bleeding, seizures, choking, and many other things besides. If you're interested in attending a dog first aid course, please find us at www.dog-first-aid.com, and if you can't find a dog first aid course in your area, then get in touch with us